I've been essentially a historian of this debate for the past 25 years. I left it a few years ago because I thought it would always be boring, because Germline was always going to be impossible, but I'm back. So this is what I'm going to talk about, believe it or not, in 20 minutes, and I will let you read that because you can read faster than I can talk. And when you see orange, that's where I am. So in case anyone nods off for a minute. This presentation is based, believe it or not, on a new book I've got coming out called The Human Gene Editing Debate. This talk is not a summary, but more like a movie preview, and hopefully will entice you to read the article that comes out and eventually the book. To talk about ethical and social implications of germline modification. And I'm going to organize my talk around the idea that essentially there are not really any critical ethical debates about things that scientists have in mind now. But what generates the vast majority of concerns is about what may happen in the future. We therefore have to find a way to talk about future ethical problems and social implications. We have relied upon the somatic germline distinction as a moral line for over 50 years, including last night, where Jennifer organized your entire talk that way. And I will argue that this distinction is on its last legs. A prominent pseudo-governmental organization in the United States has advocated removing the distinction. A scientist in China we've all heard about has supposedly moved past it. There is no moral distinction left that has any consensus, and without one, people will be able to push the technology as far as knowledge allows. The point of the talk is to show that how these moral distinctions in the debate actually work, evaluate the strengths of the distinctions that could be placed if the germline distinction is considered to be no longer morally relevant. I want to give us the tools to create new moral distinctions. The best way to understand this entire debate, all of which I think exists in the future, is a sociological version of the slippery slope metaphor. The philosophical version is considered to be bad reasoning. The sociological version is actually how cultures change. So, back to intro to philosophy. A slippery slope argument starts with a metaphorical slope with the most meritorious action at the top, and at the bottom is the action that is maximally objectionable from the view of the top. If we step onto the slope by selecting the desirable option of A, then it is more likely in the future that we will select the currently unjustifiable position of B. Arriving at B, we are then more likely to select the even less desirable option of C. The morally worthy decision at the top changes the context of the next decision, making the undesirable choice below more likely. Eventually, we're at the bottom of the slope where we did not want to be when we were taking the first step. The classic argument here is doctor-assisted suicide for terminally ill people is at A. Eventually, we're going to slide to C, which is forced euthanasia for people who are deemed to lack social value. How is the human genetic engineering debate set up? This is how it was set up in the early 1970s, and it remains to this day. There's very high consensus. The top of the slope is somatic gene therapy. We all know what that means. The vast majority of the people in 1970 or so stepped onto the slope at A, both because of the moral value of healing existing live humans with terrible diseases, and because they thought the barriers below were going to hold. And I'll get to barriers in a minute. But I'll just quote, the most conservative person in 1971 was this theologian who concluded after the barriers were built that to step on the slope and do things like cure these muscular dystrophy diseases with somatic was essentially doing God's work on earth. So, the first debates of the 50s and 60s involved eugenicists who wanted to perfect the human species. And after they lost the debate, their position became the forbidden position at the bottom of the slope, at C, that all the other positions were virtuous in relationship to. At this point, I should point out the decision of which way that this slope points is normative. Okay? There are people who want to get to the bottom of the slope as fast as they can, who want a world where humans are improved, quote unquote, in some way. Metaphorically, it would be an upward slope, and it would be sort of a slow climb towards virtue. But I'm going to describe the dominant debate, which is the sort of downward pointing slope. The bottom of the slope is the possible social and ethical implication of human gene editing that people fear. Most people are not worried about current possibilities and plans. What was just described to us, most people are not concerned about that. What they are worried about is there's no place to stop on the slope between that and the bottom that they are concerned about. So, there are two versions of this in the debate. Conservatives see the bottom of the slope as the brave new world because design is thought to treat humans like object. This is the language of dehumanization. Liberals think the bottom of the slope is Gattaca, the movie of genetically structured social inequality. So when people talk about Nazis, they're talking about either one of these visions. Now I should add that I'm talking about humans here, but for the gene drive people in the room and the plant people in the room, I could do the same thing, it's just a different bottom. The bottom is something like a fully synthesized natural world where nothing exists independent of human intentionality. Okay? But I'm sticking with humans because I have about 18 minutes left. 2, understand why the slope would slip towards Gattaca, we must discuss the terrain on the slope that can be slippery. The terrain is defined by what is morally relevant about the act on the slope. So in this debate I'm talking about, the terrain is a combination of genetic trait and target. By target, I mean that which is being changed, either an existing person or the species. Trait, we all know what trait is. Tay-Sachs is at the top. Genetic traits for intelligence, whatever that is at the bottom. The point is that the terrain of the slope consists of combinations of targets and traits, ordered from the least objectionable to the most objectionable to modify. So how does this slip 1 unit down the slope? Scholarship will tell you that small steps down slippery slopes are more likely in the absence of a sharp line between cases, where the cases are aligned as a gradient or continuum, and arguments or policies are connected by small steps. There are 2 features that encourage slipperiness along the terrain. One is continuity vagueness, where the terrain has a continuous measure. For example, an age restriction on driving, where you place it at 16, is the danger of allowing a 15-year-old to drive, a 14-year-old to drive. There's no way to stop that slide. I talk about this a lot in the book, but I'm not going to focus on it today. The second quality of slipperiness is similarity vagueness, where measurement's not possible, irrelevant, or it depends on imprecise components. So think in English of the word knife. There are lots of meanings of the word knife. Okay, it's vague, it cannot be disambiguated. And to foreshadow what I'll be talking about, I'd like you to put in the back of your mind the word disease. I'll get back to that soon. So the question then becomes similarity by what standard? Okay? By slipping down a slope depends on similarity between 2 points. What's the standard here? Well, if we're talking about the fountain pen of Barack Obama and Thomas Jefferson, they're the same standard if it's putting ink to the paper. But if the standard is age, they're radically different. Well, to bring up this word that we've been talking about the last few days, in a debate about this, the standard is moral values. 2 adjacent points on the slope can be made the same through one of those 2 processes if they're justified using the same moral value. So for example, using gene editing to stop someone being born from sickle cell and adult onset heart disease can be made the same if both are justified only using the value of beneficence. Beneficence, to translate to English, means doing good. So, the final piece of my theoretical setup here is barriers on the slippery slope. The entire ethical debate about human gene editing has always been about these barriers. Okay? And whether the bad impacts happen depend upon whether these barriers actually hold. So philosopher John Harris, who otherwise would not want to be associated with what I'm saying, has written, slopes are only slippery if they catch us unaware and we've strayed onto them inadequately equipped. The main piece of equipment is drawing a line, as Granville Williams noted very long ago. 2 legal theorists say, slippery slopes can sometimes be resisted by standing on easily enforceable bright line rules. I'm going to conceptualize these limits as barriers on the slope that stop further slipping. So the final question is then, what makes a strong barrier? A strong barrier divides 2 steps on the slope that cannot be made similar through similarity or continuity vagueness. So my point in the talk is to explain how the germline barrier is near collapse and evaluate possible barriers further down slope. So I'm all the way down to there. Unfortunately, I slowed down. The history of the barriers in the debate starts with the post-World War II reform eugenicists who wanted to perfect the human species through what we would now call human gene editing. Julian Huxley, Hermann Muller, you're probably familiar with these people. Those who wanted to conduct somatic gene therapy argued for 2 barriers on the slope below their position, which after 5 or so years became the consensus in the debate. These barriers would reassure people that they could agree to somatic gene therapy and not slip into eugenics. The first of these was the disease enhancement barrier. The scientists wanted to try to heal classic Mendelian diseases like sickle cell. The eugenicists wanted to change the human species to not only make it free of genetic disease, but to change our capacity for moral behavior and intelligence and so on. So I'm not going to talk about this barrier anymore except to say the following. This barrier worked really well when the known genetic diseases were obvious and devastating, like Tay-Sachs. And the eugenicist things were fantasies like improving the virtue of humans. Now, this barrier is incredibly weak because of our increasing knowledge about genetic contributions to various bodily traits, like propensities to this disease, that, and the other. It's just become too complicated. For a host of reasons, this barrier cannot hold. I mean, exemplified by the debate is deafness a disease? So obviously, the 1950s eugenicists could never have imagined somatic modification was possible. They were only focused on the germline. So in the 70s, proponents of somatic therapy argued for the somatic germline barrier. This was the most obvious barrier to build because the controversy at the time was in changing the species, not changing some existing person. So this results in a slope that looks like this. At the top of the slope is somatic therapy for genetic diseases like sickle cell. The barrier's in the middle. At the bottom is germline enhancement, the goal of the eugenicists that everyone was trying to distance themselves from. I want everyone to think of this germline distinction differently than the way you've been thinking about it so far in this debate. This barrier is created and has lasted for 50 years, not because it's such a morally desirable barrier. Rather, it has survived because it's the only strong barrier on the slope above where most people's moral problems begin. And I should add that I do believe it's the case that these barriers allowed the public to accept somatic therapy at the time because the scientists said, we will go no further than these here. And I think that people should keep that in mind as we go forward with this debate. It'd be useful for people to say, here and no further. So this debate is dependent upon particular values. Above the barrier in the acceptable area is justified by beneficence and non-maleficence. This means doing good and avoiding bad, basically. It was beneficent because the goal was healing disease in existing people. It advanced non-maleficence because any mistake you would make would die with the person in question. The values below the barrier were all the inverse of the bad values the eugenicists were seen as having. The eugenicists were hubristic, had authoritarian views of imposing their vision of humanity on everyone else, violating nature, violating God's will for us humans. So the proponents of this barrier advocated the inverse of all of these things: humility, non-authoritarianism, following nature, following God's will. These are all about the species, and this is what holds up the barrier to begin with. So what's on the two sides of the barrier? Upslope is modifying an individual existing human. Downslope is modifying the species. Doing the act downslope would violate those values. But how can you make these two the same through similarity vagueness, which is what's required to bring down the barrier? I would argue that you can't, if these are the values in the debate. The individual and species cannot be made the same. The individual you can actually meet, the species is an abstraction. The individual is in the present, the species is in the future. Removing disease in the individual is, to take an older language here, the role God assigned to us humans versus redesigning the species, which was what should be reserved for God. I go on and on with this in the book, many more examples, but the point is that this is implicitly the reason that this barrier was selected. It cannot be knocked over if these are the values in use in the debate. Everyone can be assured that if you step on the first step here, you will not lead the slide down to the bottom. So the barrier is extremely strong through most of the 70s, but in the 80s began to weaken when the values changed. It's been empirically demonstrated that the professions who were involved in these debates changed, with different professions having different values. What happened was bioethicists, which primarily accept beneficence and non-maleficence and justice as values, began in the mid to late 80s to argue that the value of beneficence supports acts on both sides of the barrier. As the new dominant group, they didn't pay attention so much to the one's downslope. So if we go back to 1992, when the disease enhancement barrier was strong, the head of bioethics at the NIH and gene therapy researcher French Anderson wrote, that all we only need the values of beneficence and non-maleficence, and thus the germline barrier was irrelevant, saying the searches for cure and prevention of genetic disorders by germline therapy arise from principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, which create imperatives to relieve and prevent basic causes of human suffering. Society ought not draw a moral line between intentional germline therapy and somatic cell therapy. A moral line should be drawn at enhancement. So they're saying if you're only concerned about beneficence, then you don't need this anymore. So the argument looks like this. The argument is that beneficence justifies the acts on both sides of the barrier. People who are concerned about playing God, defending the wisdom of nature, and so on, had been marginalized. Perhaps the old values were still, there somewhere, maybe far downslope. So if that's your only values that are in the debate, the barrier eventually falls. However, the barrier did not fall in the 1990s, primarily because no one wanted to take the effort because it wasn't possible. Okay? But the intellectual justification for doing so had been established. However, I'm not going to introduce this person. He's been mentioned a number of times. He basically makes the same argument from the 1990s, which is beneficence requires me to modify the germline of these children so they would supposedly be resistant to HIV. Now, while everyone agrees that he violated the ethics of clinical trials, note that the vast majority of those who've condemned him share his values about the act of human gene editing itself. Okay? They only differ on whether or not the act below is supported by non-maleficence, whether or not it was safe. So now that we understand how these barriers work, I want to evaluate a few possible barriers that people might be thinking of promoting. So you could build a barrier at safety, at non-maleficence. We've heard a lot about safety. With this barrier, the only thing that would stop us from engaging in an act of germline is that it's not safe. Again, this is the primary complaint about He Zhongqi. This means that you really don't have a germline barrier, just a safety barrier that happens to be in the same place as the germline barrier. So if that's the case, the problem with your barrier at the limits of safety is that it moves down the slope here as your skill and knowledge improves. If your only standard is safety, if the germline becomes just as safe as somatic, then germline is the same as somatic. We could call this a sliding barrier. I could call it a speed bump, but it is not a barrier. It's not a limit. So what happens then when someone comes up with giving someone athletic endurance? Okay? Well, the answer is once that becomes safe, there's no justification for saying that's wrong either, and it just slides further down the slope. Okay. So let me go through one that I think has been gestured to. Let's call it the biological reality barrier. It has the exact same sliding problem. Robert Morrison, right in 1961, referring to the eugenic movement that culminated in the Nazis, that the thing that has saved man from his limited visions in the past has been the difficulty of devising suitable means for reaching them. He was warning us about the repeated temptation to rely upon the biological reality barrier. The argument for this barrier is that it'll always be impossible to do X, so we don't have to worry about the slope below that. We could say it's always going to be impossible to modify polygenic personality traits, so that can be our barrier. I will simply say at this point that betting against human ingenuity is a loser move, okay? So my favorite example of this, if you dig into the archives of the first federal government commission on human gene editing in the early 1980s, Arno Matulski, who was a very influential geneticist at the time, said, I don't want to even discuss germline modification because I don't want to discuss anything that's not going to be possible for between 50 and 300 years. Okay, that was 35 years ago. Okay, so let's not bet against human knowledge. Okay, now let's talk about some that you could have. How about the boundary of humanity barrier? This is simply used to show one that could be strong. Eric Lander from Harvard has written that some scientists are interested in synthetic genes. We can imagine genes from other animals that provide health benefits. You could draw a boundary at the limits of humanity. Upslope would be a gene that any human has ever had, ever. Downslope, and unethical, is a variant that no human has ever had. The barrier would not be susceptible to continuity vagueness because it's not numeric. It would not be susceptible to similarity vagueness because people make such strong distinctions between humans and other life forms, so strong that anthropologists think that it's written into our brains to make this distinction, okay? So the one problem with this is that this is so far close to the bottom of the slope that no one would bother by the time you get to this point. However, it is supported by those earlier values down there somewhere, okay, about things like hubristic following nature. So I do ethnographic observation of theologians who debate these questions. This is more or less what they're concerned about, okay? The germline is just something, a nice thing that's defendable further upslope. But when it comes to it, it's more like this, which is something like moving genes around within humanity, which you could simply do by people mating with each other, versus creating new genes that humanity has never had, which you can't. So, now for the movie preview. In the book, I emphasize the strength of barriers different individuals or organizations have proposed that would be placed below the germline barrier. Those that are structurally strong and at present have supportive values, I'm put in green. Those that are not structurally strong are in red. So to summarize, the NIS has suggested a barrier at severe disease. I would argue this is beyond unstable, potentially not even placeable on the slope, because severe and disease are subject to extreme similarity vagueness, okay? So what does extreme mean to you? We could ask the regulators in the room, how do you regulate on the word extreme, okay? So that's a clear problem. Similarly, there's a bioethical debate about what's called a professional domain account, where the existing medical profession defines what a disease is, and that will be the barrier. This, too, is not even placeable because the medical profession does not only heal diseases, but engages in things like bodily enhancement with plastic surgery. Way down near the bottom is bioethic liberalism, which is sort of the Lockean liberal approach to society, which is you can do anything you want as long as you don't hurt anybody, okay? The problem is harm is similarly susceptible to similarity vagueness. Does it harm your kid if the other kids in the class are modified? I would argue that it does. Building on the NAS report, I identify a barrier at most prevalent variant. I show this is not susceptible to continuity vagueness, and you'll have to buy the book to see the punchline of how that works. So, to conclude, people's ethical concerns about germline are largely not with what is possible or what is proposed, but what lies further down the slope. Avoiding ethical problems requires building barriers on the slope. A strong barrier is one where the acts on both sides cannot be made the same through continuity or similarity vagueness. The germline barrier is structurally very sound, so it's hard to topple, but it's vulnerable to a change in values. It may be done with because few in the debate support the values that are required to hold the thing up. Safety or limits of our knowledge cannot be used as functional barriers, even though we sometimes rely upon them in the short term. Most of the barriers below the germline suggested in the debate cannot actually hold, but perhaps some can. And if you feel you want to move beyond the germline, find a barrier below or above that will hold, even if it's above your actual position, and defend it. Thank you.